From your perspective, looking at that record in Genesis, what are the implications that you see that go beyond just a garden for understanding how we live in culture, what we think, our perspective of the world around us? When we look at that record in Genesis from a historical perspective, or whether we view it as just some sort of a story?
In the world today, there are 40 different ways of measuring time, approximately, 40 different calendar systems. Some are related to the astronomical cycles, some are related to cultural cycles. All calendars are social contracts. They're ways for us to understand the passing of time. All that means is that there are lots of philosophies of history, lots of philosophies of understanding days and months and years and seasons. The Bible has this very consistent view. It has formed the basis of our own Gregorian calendar and our understanding of the intercalation of lunar cycles, solar cycles, and the equinoxes. Which is why we have this sort of unbalanced calendar system that we constantly have to adjust with little cheats like leap years and leap days. But the point of all of that is that the Bible provides us with this very consistent view. Every other view of history is attempting to adapt itself to certain worldview presuppositions. So, when you stop viewing the Bible as history, when you stop viewing an actual historical Adam and Eve and start to impose new understandings, you're just dragging your worldview onto the understanding of mankind through the ages. It's why moderns can suddenly, out of the blue, come up with new views of sexuality, new views of the nature of culture or of government, and impose those as if these are now the discoveries of modern science. They're no such thing. What they are is the imposition of a worldview assumption on an existing order.
So there's something deeper associated with what happens to a culture, to one's worldview, if you remove a literal Adam and Eve. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. If you remove a literal Adam and Eve, that changes the whole shape of what history is and how history is remembered. One of the things that we know about modern history, the writing of our current historical works, is that they're revising all of the understandings of the past as if we know better somehow. What happened? What motivations drove certain events? When we separate ourselves from the actual historical record and start determining, based on our assumptions, what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's false, what belongs, what doesn't, suddenly we have this cafeteria-style approach to history that then becomes a cafeteria-style approach to morality, cafeteria-style approach to cultures. It brings about real chaos.
Is that because when we pull an Adam and Eve out of a historical record, we can then pretty much make up what we think about man and marriage and even sexuality?
Absolutely. One of the things that happens when you separate yourself from this linear view of history is that you have to make compensation somewhere, somehow. In the same way that the earliest peoples and civilizations had to compensate for now the new reality of a fallen world, and from that develop technologies, develop farming methods, etc. When we have a kind of trajectory approach to history, where we're following our experience and our ideas, you start to change everything, and you build cultural constructs around those changes. They may not seem all that significant at first, but it's like any line that starts to depart from a baseline, the further it goes, the more exponentially the separation becomes. And suddenly you've got a world that you don't even recognize.
George, when you see what's happening in our culture today, do you then tie it somehow back to our view of Genesis and that early historical account?
Anytime you uncouple a culture from the wisdom of the ages, you start to see a wild sort of new direction for the culture that's very unpredictable. Because the book of Genesis teaches us how to do history and teaches us what is important in history, how to record it, because it's intensely personal, thus the generational succession that we see in the Toldos, the genealogies, which are the heart and soul of it, showing us the whole flow of history. When you excise that as true history from our calculations of our own time, invariably we're going to be uncoupled from all of history. You rid yourself of history, and suddenly not only do we not know where we are or how we got here, we don't know the trajectory of providence across time, so we don't know where we're going.
Do you think there's something in the fallen nature of man that kind of drives us towards a desire to get rid of that historical root and basis?
Well, of course. I mean, you and I both know as men, we like to be in charge. We like to control things. We would love to be able to erase our mistakes, kind of start fresh, turn over a new leaf, begin again, reinvent ourselves. That is the common impulse of us all. It's this illusion that somehow we can do this. Everybody who's ever had a child knows that somewhere around the age of 2, there is this stage where the child says, "I do it myself." Well, the problem is that that's something that continues all of our lives. We think we can do this ourselves. We can define things ourselves. We can shape things ourselves, and then we can control all of the second and third order consequences. It's simply not true. We can look at all of human history and know that it's not true. We have sentimental attachments, feelings about certain movements, but if you separate those movements from their history, then you're in serious trouble. So, for instance, we have a lot of millennials today who are infatuated with socialism. They don't even know what socialism is. They don't know that it's an economic theory. They don't know the history of the failures of socialism throughout time. They just have this sort of nice, fuzzy feeling that in socialism, we care about each other. We're diverse. You have to look at Mao's Cultural Revolution, or the purges of Stalin against the kulaks, the failures of democratic socialism in the countries of Western Europe to understand what socialism is. But none of that is taken into consideration. You cut things off from history, and you lose sight of the meaning of all of it.
So again, that's the desire of man to be able to do what he wants to do without the guilt associated with some transcendent ought that would be established if you saw Genesis as history.
Francis Schaeffer always used to say that humanism is man at the center of all things. And in particular, this man at this time. It's a self-centered perspective. Well, if I'm the beginning and end of all things, if I've replaced the Alpha and the Omega with my own sense of being Alpha and Omega, then I can do whatever I want, however I want. That's an incredibly pleasing thing to the pride of man. Unfortunately, it's always a disaster in history.
George, you've been a pastor for almost 40 years, is that right?
Yes.
So you have been dealing with this issue for some time. with people, and no doubt people are complex, but there has to be some underlying reasons as to why mankind gravitates towards a paradigm that doesn't have a lot of support. How do you deal with this, and how do you see that?
Most people don't set out to adjust their theology to accommodate their morality. That may be true for a number of intellectuals or academicians, but the ordinary person is not trying to justify their sin in order to, find a basis for a changed theology. They tend to drift. They drift on the tides of the culture, and they listen to what the culture says. They are not profoundly aware of the facts, and so they're in a sense victimized by their own ignorance. They don't read the controversies of the past in order to understand the controversies of the present. So they're not reading or thinking outside of their own time. They even great scholars sometimes get stuck in the literature of the day. And that creates a peculiar kind of myopia in our understanding. I think the biggest thing, though, is that most Christians really want to be taken seriously by the world around us. The Bible tells us that we are peculiar people. We've been set apart. We don't want to be peculiar. We don't want to be odd. We want to fit in. We want to be able to enter into the great conversation of the age. And so what happens is that bit by bit, piece by piece, we accommodate ourselves, sometimes in order to build bridges to our culture. Sometimes it's just to give us credentials with the culture. But we wind up in this great cultural drift, and before we know it, we are a long way from where we started. And we may look back and we think to ourselves, how did we get here? But we're not thinking about the implications. We're not connecting the dots. We're simply drifting.
Right. And Paul was dealing with that, was he not? With those who wanted to fit in, as opposed to going the way, which was so radical at that time.
I think you can understand the book of Galatians entirely as an accommodationist theology by those who had come out of Pharisaical Judaism, trying to figure out a way to make themselves somehow acceptable to their fellow Pharisees. And the result was they wound up in a heretical position where grace was trumped by law.
If you were counseling someone who is wrestling with these issues, where would you point them?
Well, the first thing that I would do is I would ask them to read the Bible itself and see how the Bible itself speaks about all of the issues that are swirling around us. Cornelius Van Til once said that the Bible speaks authoritatively on everything of which it speaks, and it speaks of everything. So starting place is Scripture. But then I would seek to get them tools, good tools to examine the actual data, the real scientific, substantiated truths, so that they could then calibrate their thinking with something that's a lot more substantial than their feelings or their desires to be accepted by their peers.
Well, one thing we have found in this quest that we have been on, and we've met with some very, very brilliant people, and that is that you don't have to be non-scientific to hold to what the Scripture says, that the scientific evidence is there and supports what Genesis tells us.
Yeah, whether we're talking about geology and the layering of rock structures, or hydrology and evidence for magma coming up off the ocean floors, creation of an atmosphere that is perfect for an ice age, which is unexplainable in any other way.
Right.
Or if it's simply looking at ancient texts and reading them as they were intended to be read, all of the evidence constantly and consistently supports the truth of the historicity of the Scriptures.
Well, that evidence is there, but we find ourselves in our culture with a strong flow that comes from academia, from media, and all of that is sweeping us in another direction. How do you encourage people in a culture like that?
Well, one of the things that we have to do is make sure that our inputs are good inputs. We need to stop absorbing everything that our culture tells us. We need to be very, very careful about the kind of media that we consume. That's a starting place. Secondly, we need to undertake the study of these things in the midst of community rather than in isolation. What I find, and I know you find this all over the country and all over the world, is people saying, I didn't know anybody else thought this. Oh, I feel so alone. Right. And so to create communities of learning where people can wrestle with these things and be reinforced and encouraged is really, really important.
Well, George, all of this brings us back then to the notion that the history that's recorded in Genesis, or any true history at all, is critical for us in terms of understanding what's going on around us.
Yeah, in fact, what I would say is that history is what helps shape and direct science itself, not the other way around. We need to understand what happened, and then science can help us understand how it happened. But science doesn't tell us what happened. What we've got to do is we've got to start with this notion that there is truth that has been revealed. It may have lots of mysteries interwoven into it, but science can help us unravel some of those mysteries. But we know that science is ever shifting and ever changing. We don't have the same medical practices, thank goodness, that we had 150 years ago. And I think that however long the Lord may tarry, 150 years from now, they're going to look back at, say, something like chemotherapy and say, what a brutal practice. What were they thinking about? So science is on this progressive path of discovery, but what history does is it grounds that progressive path of discovery in a clear line of understandability. That history becomes the anchor then for everything else. And when we unhinge our sense of culture from that anchor, then we're altogether adrift. We lose our sense of our identity. We lose a sense of the purpose and the meaning of man, the nature of gender, sex, marriage, all of it.
And all of that is what God gave to us when He gave us that historical record of what He did in the very beginning.
Starting in the garden.